Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up for an emotional roller coaster that begins at 30,000 feet in the sky, where one young woman's battle for dignity collides with shocking discrimination in the most unexpected place, an airplane cabin. From the glamorous promise of bubbly champagne to the sting of racist undertones, tensions soar in a high-stakes confrontation that shakes everyone on board. Witness the ultimate twist when this determined black woman flips the narrative on its head, pulling out a surprise that no one sees coming. In this tale of pride, resilience, and sweet, sweet karma, prepare yourselves for a flight you'll never forget. Ebony Johnson had been dreaming of this trip to Paris for as long as she could remember. Growing up in a modest Atlanta neighborhood, she'd always envisioned visiting the City of Light, strolling along the Seine, and soaking in the Renaissance art at the Louvre. Finally, after saving for years, picking up extra shifts at her job, and earning a partial scholarship for a study abroad program, she was ready. The day she stepped into the departure hall at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City, Ebony could practically hear her heart pounding to the rhythm of pure excitement. All around her, the airport buzzed with frenetic energy. Families hurried to catch connecting flights. Business travelers sipped coffee while checking emails on their phones, and wide-eyed tourists admired the architectural expanse of Terminal 4. Ebony couldn't help but compare the vibe to the anticipation of stepping onto a big stage. For her, this was the first major trip out of the country. She had packed carefully, ensuring her carry-on contained essentials. A soft travel pillow, a few protein bars, a brand new journal, and something that brought a cheeky smile to her face, a small bottle of Moët and Chandon champagne with a customized label bearing her name in gold cursive script. A gift from her cousin, who loved to celebrate Ebony's milestones with flair. While Ebony's main flight was to Paris, she had a short domestic hop from Atlanta to New York. That leg had been uneventful, a standard seat in economy, no fuss, no drama. But from New York to Paris, Ebony had decided to treat herself. She'd found a surprisingly good deal on a business class upgrade on an airline called Aeroworld. The airline had decent reviews online, praising comfortable seats and reasonably polite staff. For Ebony, who rarely splurged, this was to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, stretching out in a wide seat, savoring the chef-curated meals and sipping champagne at cruising altitude. If anything, she was determined to relish every moment. She had no idea that fate had other plans. As Ebony made her way to the lounge, where business-class passengers could wait before boarding, she noticed a few heads turning. She was dressed in a stylish burgundy jumpsuit, elegant but comfortable enough for a long flight. Her long braids were tied back in a loose bun, revealing a set of gold hoop earrings that caught the overhead lighting just right. She looked every bit the woman who was set on conquering the world, starting with the runway of Paris fashion. Ebony approached the lounge's front desk, where a young woman named Marissa greeted her. Marissa scanned Ebony's boarding pass without any apparent issue, but Ebony sensed a brief flicker of surprise cross the attendant's eyes. Perhaps Ebony thought it wasn't every day that a young black woman came through solo with a business-class ticket. Still, Marissa quickly pasted on a professional smile and ushered Ebony inside. Ebony found a comfortable chair near the window and immersed herself in a daydream about the Eiffel Tower sparkling at night. 10 minutes later, her daydream was interrupted by a scene unfolding at the lounge entrance. A tall flight attendant in an Aeroworld uniform name tag, reading Irene, was speaking rather sternly with an older black couple. Something about their boarding pass not scanning correctly. The couple insisted that they'd purchased business-class seats, just like Ebony had. But from Irene's body language, arms folded exasperated sighs, Ebony sensed the flight attendant was leaning toward disbelief rather than solution. She tried not to jump to conclusions. After all, flight attendants had a tough job. Mistakes with boarding passes happened. Yet a part of Ebony couldn't shake the uncomfortable notion that Irene's suspicion might stem from bias. Ebony watched as the lounge agent Marissa hurried over and within seconds resolved the issue by re-scanning the older couple's passes. The problem vanished as quickly as it had started, leaving an awkward moment lingering in the air. Irene walked off without so much as an apology. Ebony glanced at the older couple who caught her eye and smiled apologetically, as if to say, "We're used to it, but thanks for caring." Ebony forced a polite smile in return, feeling a knot of unease settle into her stomach. She told herself that her flight would be different, that she'd manage to enjoy her first big overseas adventure, no matter what. She had no idea how tested that resolve would soon become. Boarding for flight A-07 to Paris began at dusk. The gateway corridor was flanked by glossy posters of Aeroworld's destinations. Ebony took a quick selfie, capturing her passport and boarding pass in hand. "I'm off to my dream city," she captioned it on her Instagram story, receiving a flurry of encouraging messages from friends and family. She made her way down the jet bridge to the wide-bodied plane. Upon entering, Ebony's eyes lit up at the sleek interior of the business-class cabin. The seats were arranged in spacious pods, each boasting a large entertainment screen, plush pillows, and enough legroom for even the tallest travelers. She located her seat 4A, close to a window so she could watch the city lights fade beneath her as she soared across the Atlantic. Once settled, Ebony ran her hands over the seat controls, testing the incline and exploring the seat's massage function. She smiled to herself, feeling a giddy sense of pride. This was her moment. This was the sort of comfort she'd never experienced, and she was determined to savor every second. Just as she was adjusting her seatbelt, she felt a presence beside her. "Hello there," a warm voice greeted. Ebony looked up to see a middle-aged black woman in a tailored navy blue uniform. Her name tag read Layla. She appeared to be a senior flight attendant. "May I offer you a welcome beverage? We have orange juice water or champagne." Ebony's face broke into a grin. "Champagne, please," she said, without hesitation. Layla nodded and returned moments later with a delicate flute of bubbly. Ebony took a small sip, letting the effervescence dance on her tongue. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and finally allowed her shoulders to relax. The stress of months of planning and the tension she'd felt earlier dissipated, replaced by a sense of pure anticipation for what lay ahead. But her calm was abruptly disrupted when another flight attendant appeared, none other than Irene, the same woman Ebony had witnessed in the lounge. Irene paused upon seeing Ebony, eyeing the champagne flute in her hand. Though she said nothing, her stiff expression spoke volumes. Ebony offered a friendly, polite nod, but Irene merely turned on her heels and walked off. It was a small moment, easily shrugged off in a more perfect world. But Ebony couldn't deny that the look in Irene's eyes, an icy gaze, as though Ebony was in a place she didn't belong, unsettled her. Ebony silently reminded herself that she had paid for her seat, that she had every right to enjoy this experience. She turned back to the in-flight magazine, determined not to let a suspicious glare ruin her mood. The plane took off smoothly. As the engines roared and the runway blurred into streaks of light, Ebony felt a surge of excitement. She looked out the window, watching New York's skyline fade into the distance. Within minutes, the seatbelt sign flicked off and the flight attendants began their service. Layla wheeled out the cart greeting passengers and taking dinner orders. She seemed warm and efficient, explaining the menu options. A choice between a roasted salmon dish with lemon butter sauce or a seasonal vegetable risotto. Ebony chose the salmon and requested another glass of champagne to celebrate the journey. Layla nodded amiably and moved on to the next seat. A few minutes later, Ebony was idly scrolling through the in-flight entertainment selection, considering whether to watch a comedy or a classic drama when she overheard hushed but urgent voices from the galley behind the curtain. She couldn't make out every word, but she distinctly caught, "Who told her she could have that?" And, "No, it's standard for business class," followed by, "Just watch her." "Okay." Her heart skipped a beat. Was that about her? She tried to dismiss it, but the uneasy feeling in her gut returned. This was supposed to be a flight of comfort and luxury. But Ebony couldn't relax with the sense that someone was targeting her for reasons she couldn't fully grasp. Eventually, dinner was served along with the second glass of champagne. Ebony thanked Layla with a soft smile and tried to focus on her meal, which was flavorful and beautifully plated. But every few minutes, she caught Irene strolling past her seat, stealing quick glances as though anticipating some sort of unruly behavior. Ebony forced herself to maintain her composure, silently reciting her mother's words of wisdom. Don't ever let them see you sweat. After the dinner trays were cleared, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, and most passengers began settling in for a night's rest. A few travelers popped sleeping pills or put on eye masks while others tuned their screens to relaxing music channels. Ebony, still feeling wide awake from adrenaline, decided to watch a classic movie. She settled on breakfast at Tiffany's, the ideal whimsical start to a Paris adventure. Halfway through the film, Ebony noticed that her water cup was empty. She decided to stretch her legs and walk to the galley to ask for a refill. As she approached, she heard Irene's voice. "I just don't trust it. First, she's guzzling champagne. Now she's wandering around," Irene muttered to a younger flight attendant, a blonde woman whose name Ebony didn't catch. "She's a passenger," the younger flight attendant said quietly, seeming uncomfortable. "We offer champagne to business-class passengers." Yes, but not all of them keep asking for more, and Irene abruptly stopped when she noticed Ebony standing there. Her features hardened, and she forced a tight-lipped smile. "Can I help you?" Ebony offered a polite nod. "I was just wondering if I could get some water." Irene crossed her arms, glancing pointedly at Ebony's outfit and then her hair. The blatant scrutiny was impossible to ignore. "I think you've had enough beverages." "Don't you?" The tone was dripping with condescension. Ebony's heart pounded. She felt a rush of heat rise to her cheeks. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I'd like some water, please." A flicker of defiance crossed Irene's face. "You know I've had passengers try to sneak into business class before. I'm just making sure everything is in order." Ebony swallowed a retort. This was beyond humiliating. She was about to speak when Layla appeared from behind the beverage cart, sensing the tension. "Is there an issue here?" she asked, her tone measured. Irene didn't back down. "I was simply ensuring that Ms. Johnson—" She glanced at Ebony's boarding pass in Ebony's hand. "Is aware that we have a limit to alcoholic service, and she's already had 2 glasses. Ebony interjected. "Actually, I only asked for water this time. And for the record, I haven't been overserved. 2 glasses of champagne during a meal is hardly excessive in business class." Layla cleared her throat. "Of course. Let me get you some water, Ms. Johnson." She reached for a fresh bottle and handed it to Ebony. her eyes quietly apologizing for the confrontation. Ebony felt a swirl of anger and embarrassment. She locked eyes with Irene for a moment, a silent standoff that spoke of decades of prejudice compressed into a single moment. Finally, she turned and walked back to her seat, noticing how some other passengers in the business cabin had watched the exchange with thinly veiled curiosity. She sank into her seat, her appetite for in-flight entertainment utterly destroyed. 30 minutes later, Ebony was still wide awake, her thoughts churning like a stormy ocean. She replayed the conversation in her mind, each time feeling more aggrieved. Why was Irene so convinced Ebony was out of line? Because Ebony was young, because she was black, because she dared to occupy a seat in a space some people still believed wasn't meant for her. The plane hummed softly, a lullaby for those who slept. Ebony decided to distract herself by rummaging through her carry-on bag. She pulled out her journal and began jotting down thoughts. She wrote about her excitement for Paris, her gratitude for the opportunity, and the frustration she felt at being singled out on what should have been a perfect experience. Writing often helped her process her emotions, giving her an outlet that felt safer than confrontation. As she flipped to a fresh page, her hand brushed against something at the bottom of the bag. The little bottle of Moet and Chandon that her cousin had gifted her, the one with Ebony's name custom printed on the label. A small smile tugged at her lips. The plan had been to open it in her Parisian hotel room to toast her arrival. But a spark of an idea lit her mind. Maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim her dignity in a subtle yet powerful way. She looked around. Most of the cabin was either dozing or absorbed in movies behind half-shut privacy screens. Ebony carefully unzipped the protective wrapping on the bottle. The label glinted in the dim cabin light. Her name, Ebony Johnson, in cursive gold script. The bottle was only a quarter the size of a standard champagne bottle, an individual serving. She couldn't help but chuckle wryly at the irony. The flight attendant who refused her more champagne was about to see she'd come prepared with her own. Just then Layla approached Ebony's seat, noticing the bottle. She raised an eyebrow, though there was no malice in her expression. "May I ask where you got that?" she whispered, not wanting to disturb other passengers. Ebony explained quietly. "It's a gift from my cousin. I wasn't planning to open it here, but I think I might need a little self-celebration after. Well, you know." Layla pressed her lips together in a sympathetic frown. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer. "Under normal circumstances, we don't allow outside alcohol to be consumed on board." But she paused, seeming to weigh the situation. "I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. I'm sorry about what happened. I'll talk to Irene." Ebony nodded, grateful for this small mercy. "Thank you," she whispered. Part of her wanted to hide the bottle away and forget the whole thing, but another part felt a strong urge to claim her space to enjoy the champagne that she had every right to savor. A few moments later, Ebony decided to open the bottle quietly. She unscrewed the top with delicate care, careful not to let the pop echo through the cabin. The faint fizz filled her cup, and she lifted it to her lips. She closed her eyes, savoring the crisp taste of celebration, tinged with defiance. She whispered to herself, "This is for me." It wasn't long before Ebony's private celebration was interrupted in the worst way possible. As she set the little champagne bottle in the seat pocket, Irene re-emerged. Her sharp eyes zoomed in on the bottle, narrowing with suspicion. Without any preamble, she demanded in a hushed but furious tone, "Where did you get that?" "We did not serve you that champagne." Ebony tried to maintain her composure, though her pulse quickened. "It's mine," she replied, keeping her voice level. "A personal gift, and I wasn't planning to cause any trouble." Irene snatched up the bottle and inspected the label as though searching for contraband. Her lips curled in disapproval. Consuming outside alcohol is against airline policy. Ebony had expected pushback, but not this intensity. "I understand," she said softly, "but we're at 30,000 feet, and I didn't think a small toast would hurt anyone." Irene let out a mirthless chuckle. "I don't know what's going on here, but passengers have been removed from flights for less." "Are you intoxicated?" That question stung like a slap. Ebony's eyes flashed with indignation. "No, I'm not intoxicated. I've had 3 small glasses in total, spread over hours. I know my limits. You're overreacting." Irene's voice rose slightly enough to attract attention from nearby passengers. "We have a duty to maintain safety. If a passenger is acting suspiciously or intoxicated..." Another flight attendant, the young blonde woman, peered from the galley. Concern showed on her face, but she seemed too timid to intervene. However, Ebony noticed some other travelers craning their necks hearing the commotion. Among them was a tall, middle-aged white man who eyed the scene with confusion. Ebony's anger was rising, but she struggled to keep it in check. "You're discriminating against me," she said, her voice trembling. "You're targeting me simply because you think I don't belong in this seat." Irene drew herself up. "How dare you accuse me of that?" She spat, her tone dangerously low. "If you continue, I'll report you to the captain for belligerent behavior." At that moment, Ebony felt the tears threaten to well in her eyes. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that her mere presence on this flight was something she had every right to. She refused to apologize for existing in a space for which she had paid. "I have done nothing wrong," Ebony said firmly, meeting Irene's glare head-on. "Is there a problem here?" A man's voice cut through the tension. It was the tall, middle-aged white passenger Ebony had noticed earlier. He stood now, leaning into the aisle. His expression was tinged with concern. "I'm an off-duty pilot with Aero World," he explained, flashing a company ID. I heard raised voices. "Everything all right?" Irene hesitated, glancing at Ebony, then at the ID. She cleared her throat. "Everything is under control, sir." Ebony swallowed her pride, deciding to speak up. She explained calmly to the off-duty pilot that she was being accused of drinking excessively and of violating policy. "I had a small bottle of champagne given to me as a gift," she said. "I was unaware it was such a serious infraction, and I certainly haven't become unruly." The pilot eyed Ebony carefully, as if trying to gauge whether she was intoxicated or aggressive. After a few moments, he turned to Irene. "I can vouch that she doesn't seem intoxicated. Perhaps this can be handled more discreetly." Irene's face darkened with anger, but she forced a smile. "Of course. Let's keep it discreet." Ebony could sense the pilot's intervention diffused the immediate threat of being reported or removed, but she also knew Irene wouldn't let this go. The tension lingered like an unspoken threat in the pressurized cabin air. After the tense exchange, Ebony sank into her seat. Her nerves frayed. Her cheeks were hot with both humiliation and anger. She put her hands over her face, exhaling shakily. She had never felt so attacked, so singled out, simply for existing in a place she had every right to be. The joy of her Paris adventure was threatening to vanish, replaced by the sour taste of injustice. A few minutes later, the middle-aged pilot, whose name Ebony learned was Hank, approached her discreetly. Kneeling beside her seat, He said in a low voice, "I'm sorry you're going through this. I don't have the authority to override the on-duty cabin crew, but I just want you to know that not everyone at AeroWorld supports this kind of treatment." Ebony blinked back tears, managing a grateful nod. "Thank you for saying that." Hank reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you need to file a complaint, feel free to mention that I witnessed at least part of the interaction." He paused, scanning Ebony's expression. "I understand how these situations can escalate, and I don't want this to ruin your trip." Ebony took the card, pressing it between her trembling fingers. She felt a wave of appreciation for this man, who in a small but significant way had come to her defense. "I really appreciate it," she whispered. As Hank returned to his seat, Ebony felt a sliver of hope. Maybe the next chapters of this flight would be quieter. Maybe she could simply watch her movie try to sleep and wake up to the sunrise over the Atlantic, eager for her first glimpse of Europe. But fate had other plans. Somewhere behind the scenes, friction was building. Irene was not one to let a perceived offense slide, and Ebony was unwilling to be a doormat. The next confrontation, Ebony feared, would be even more explosive. The cabin lights had been dimmed for overnight rest. Many passengers were dozing, their seats fully reclined into flat beds. Ebony tried to will herself to sleep, but every rustle of movement or click of a seatbelt made her heart jump. Her stomach churned with the memory of Irene's accusations. She fiddled with the flight entertainment system, selecting soothing music. 2 hours passed in restless limbo, Ebony drifting in and out of a half-sleep. She was jolted awake by the overhead reading light flicking on across the aisle. She opened her eyes to see Irene hovering above a passenger, a young black man traveling with a teenage boy, presumably his son. The father was rummaging in the overhead bin. "I told you," Irene was saying in a pointed whisper, "that the overhead bins above row 4 are reserved for seats 4A and 4B. Your seats are 5A and 5B. The man looked puzzled. "We needed to store our camera equipment," he explained. "The bins above row 5 were already full. There was space here, so we used it. That's what we usually do." Irene's tone was clipped. "Well, you need to move your items. This is not your assigned bin." Ebony watched, feeling the same sense of unease. Perhaps it was just a coincidence that Irene had singled out another black passenger, but Ebony felt a gnawing suspicion. She observed the father politely comply, shifting the camera bag to a bin across the aisle. Irene walked off with an air of self-righteousness. When Ebony glanced around, she noticed other overhead bins were full of random carry-ons, not necessarily aligned with seat assignments. Rarely did flight attendants enforce overhead bin assignments with such rigidity, especially if the bins were not fully occupied. Ebony felt that knot of tension again. Something was definitely off. The father with the teenage boy caught Ebony's eye, as if sensing her sympathy. Ebony half smiled. "Rough flight, huh?" she whispered. He shrugged, a resigned look on his face. "We had the same flight attendant fuss at us during boarding, something about checking our seat numbers. Thought it was just a one-time thing, but apparently not." Ebony felt a pang of camaraderie. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that." He nodded gently, patting his son's back, urging him to go back to sleep. "We'll be fine," he said quietly, though Ebony saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. A moment later, Layla passed by, likely performing a routine check. Ebony mustered the courage to flag her down. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so as not to disturb the dozing passengers. "I'm sorry to bother you," Ebony began, "but is everything okay? That flight attendant, Irene, seems to be targeting multiple passengers. It's not just me, and it's not just about champagne. Layla sighed, looking drained. I apologize for all this. Irene is, well, she can be very by the book. Sometimes overly so. I've spoken to her once, but I'll talk to her again. Ebony decided not to push further, sensing Layla was caught in a difficult position. But as Layla retreated, Ebony promised herself she wouldn't stay silent if things escalated. She had come too far, saved too long, worked too hard to let discrimination overshadow her journey. Nearing the halfway point of the transatlantic flight, Ebony felt another wave of exhaustion. Finally, she reclined her seat to lie flat and managed to drift off. She dreamt of strolling along the Seine in the bright daylight wearing a chic French beret. But that reverie was shattered when she awoke to Irene's voice echoing through the cabin, calling for a passenger to identify themselves. At first, Ebony couldn't make out the details. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. The overhead lights were back on in the aisle. Call for Ms. Ebony Johnson. Please make yourself known to the cabin crew. Ebony's heart hammered. Why were they calling her name publicly? She pressed the call button. Moments later, Irene appeared with a strained expression. We need a word in the galley. Ebony unfastened her seatbelt and followed dread coiling in her stomach. In the galley away from other passengers, Irene looked Ebony up and down. We've received a complaint about a strong odor of alcohol coming from your seat. For a second, Ebony was speechless. A complaint, she echoed. Are you sure it's about me? Irene folded her arms, unwavering. Yes. We've been informed that you might be intoxicated. Ebony felt a surge of heat flare across her face. This is absolutely false. I haven't had a drink in hours except water. If you want, you can smell my breath or do whatever test you need to. This is harassment. Irene pursed her lips, not budging. We have an obligation to ensure the safety of all passengers. If there's reason to believe you're under the influence, Ebony cut her off. This is absurd. I'm not under the influence, and I have the right to know who made this complaint. Irene's eyes flashed. The airline does not disclose that information. Now either you comply with our evaluation, or we'll have to involve the captain. This was too much. Ebony felt tears of rage and helplessness begin to pool at the corners of her eyes. She couldn't let her voice crack, couldn't show any sign of weakness. Fine, she said. Bring the captain and test me. But you're going to regret this when the truth comes out. Irene looked momentarily taken aback by Ebony's defiance. Stay here, she snapped, leaving Ebony alone in the galley, with her heart pounding like a drum. The hum of the plane's engines seemed to grow louder, drowning out Ebony's swirling thoughts. A few tense minutes later, the captain arrived, a tall man in his late 50s, exuding an air of authority. His name tag read, Captain Richard Morgan. Ebony stood stiffly, arms at her sides. Irene hovered behind him. The captain's voice was calm, but firm. Ms. Johnson, we've received a report that you may be intoxicated and causing a disturbance. I'd like to assess the situation fairly. Please tell me your perspective. Ebony swallowed and poured out her explanation. She described how she'd had 2 glasses of champagne during dinner, plus a small personal bottle hours ago. She detailed how she'd been repeatedly singled out and harassed. Ebony also mentioned Hank, the off-duty pilot, who had vouched for her sobriety earlier. Ebony's voice shook slightly, but she remained composed, reciting the facts. Captain Morgan listened attentively. After Ebony finished, he turned to Irene. Is she slurring her words? Stumbling? Has she threatened anyone? Irene opened and closed her mouth, struggling to articulate a concrete accusation. She's had multiple alcoholic beverages. She brought her own alcohol on board. And passengers reported a smell. The captain raised an eyebrow. Are these the same passengers who are awake right now? Or did you go around soliciting complaints because you believed Ms. Johnson was at fault? There was an edge to his tone that made Ebony breathe a quiet sigh of relief. Irene sputtered. No, someone said. Captain Morgan turned back to Ebony. He handed her a small breathalyzer device standard on some airlines for borderline cases. If you're willing, please blow into this. Ebony complied without hesitation, her eyes never leaving Irene's. A few seconds later, the device beeped. The captain glanced at the reading. Whatever it displayed, his expression remained neutral. Ms. Johnson is not showing signs of intoxication. Irene. I see no cause to escalate this further. Ebony exhaled a wave of relief. She felt vindicated, but the injustice she'd endured still stung. Thank you, Captain, she said quietly. Captain Morgan handed the device back to Irene. Then he addressed Ebony. I'm sorry for any inconvenience. Let's try to make the rest of your flight more comfortable. Before leaving, he gave Irene a sharp look. We have a duty to serve all passengers respectfully, especially in our premium cabins. Understood. Irene reddened, nodding stiffly. As the captain walked away, Ebony dared a glance at Irene. The flight attendant's features twisted with resentment, but she said nothing. Ebony returned to her seat, the adrenaline draining from her limbs, leaving exhaustion in its wake. She had never imagined she'd spend a transatlantic flight battling accusations instead of relaxing. Word of the confrontation spread through the business-class cabin. Quietly, a few passengers who had overheard or witnessed pieces of the drama approached Ebony to offer support. One was a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Harriet Monroe, a professor of sociology at NYU. She took the seat next to Ebony while adjusting her carry-on. Forgive my intrusiveness, Dr. Monroe said in a hushed tone, but I noticed how that flight attendant was treating you. I want you to know I took notes literally. This is the sort of real-world case study I discuss in my classes on systemic bias. Ebony felt a mix of gratitude and weariness. I appreciate that. It's been a nightmare. I'm just trying to get to Paris. Dr. Monroe offered a reassuring smile. Your trip's still ahead of you. Don't let them rob you of your joy. She handed Ebony a slip of paper with her contact information. If you need a witness statement or anything else, I'm here. Ebony thanked her, tucking the note safely in her journal. More and more, she felt a sense of unity with other passengers who'd seen the injustice. For all of Irene's hostility, Ebony was discovering that empathy could shine in the darkness. As the flight neared its last 2 hours, the mood in the cabin shifted. Passengers woke up to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the gentle clinking of breakfast trays. Layla and the other flight attendants scurried back and forth, preparing the final meal service. Ebony found her appetite diminished by the drama, but she forced herself to eat something to steady her nerves. While sipping coffee, Ebony looked out the window. The sun was rising, painting the horizon with streaks of pink and gold. Land masses far below hinted that Europe was not too far away. She hoped the final leg of this flight would pass without further confrontation. That's when she noticed Irene stalking down the aisle, stopping at Ebony's row. Irene's face was taut with tension, but she forced a polite tone. Breakfast for you, Ms. Johnson. We have omelettes or French toast. Ebony tried to match the facade of politeness. French toast, please. Irene nodded and handed Ebony a tray. For a moment, Ebony thought maybe the flight attendant had decided to end this conflict. She began cutting into her meal, noticing the sweet aroma of cinnamon. But before she could take a bite, she heard the dreaded sound of an argument erupt behind her. A female passenger was exclaiming, "I told you I ordered a vegetarian meal." Sure enough, Ebony turned to see the young blonde flight attendant apologizing profusely to a South Asian woman who was upset that her vegetarian meal was not on board. Irene interjected, "Ma'am, you should have confirmed at check-in. We only have so many vegetarian meals." The passenger's dark eyes flashed. "I have the confirmation email. You lost my meal." Irene responded with a dismissive shrug that Ebony had by now come to loathe. The passenger appealed to Ebony and the father from row 5, as if inviting them to share their own experiences. Ebony glanced down at her tray, and then back at the tension building just a few feet away. She felt a wave of empathy for the woman. She knew how it felt to be stone-walled. But Ebony decided she was done stepping into conflict. She quietly turned her focus back to her tray. She had no energy left for another confrontation. Let this flight end, she thought. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing they would begin their descent into Charles de Gaulle Airport shortly. Passengers reoriented their seats, stowed personal items, and prepared for landing. Ebony felt a surge of relief. She was almost free from this airborne microcosm of stress. Yet a part of her braced for a final confrontation. She noticed Irene scribbling on a small notepad. Her expression was severe, and Ebony wondered if the flight attendant was planning some final complaint to deliver to airport authorities upon landing. The seatbelt sign came on, and the plane glided downward. The mechanical whir of the landing gear deploying reverberated under Ebony's feet. She held her breath as the wheels touched the runway with a jolt, the plane decelerating rapidly. After a few tense moments, the flight slowed to a crawl, taxiing toward the gate. By the time the seatbelt sign turned off, Ebony's emotions had reached a boiling point. She rose, collecting her carry-on, the custom champagne bottle, and her journal. She was determined to exit swiftly. A chorus of seatbelt clicks and overhead bins opening filled the cabin. As Ebony stepped into the aisle, she locked eyes with Irene one last time. Irene wore a tight smile, as though daring Ebony to say something. Ebony held her gaze, then turned away. No words were necessary. The moment spoke volumes. Ebony stepped off the plane, her heart pounding, leaving behind the most harrowing flight of her life. Despite Ebony's wishes, the ordeal wasn't quite over. As she entered the terminal, 2 uniformed AeroWorld ground staff waited beside a man in a suit who introduced himself as Regional Manager Eric Larrabee. His expression was cordial enough. He gestured for Ebony to step aside from the passenger flow. "Ms. Johnson, may we speak with you?" Larrabee asked. Ebony felt her stomach sink, but she nodded. She followed them to a quieter corner of the terminal. She noticed Dr. Monroe, the father-son duo, and even Hank, the off-duty pilot, loitering nearby, watching with concern. Larrabee cleared his throat. "I understand there were some issues on your flight regarding alcohol consumption and alleged misconduct. I've spoken briefly with the captain. We'd like to hear your side." Ebony took a breath, summoning her composure. "I was repeatedly targeted by flight attendant Irene, who accused me of being intoxicated without basis. The captain tested me and I was sober. I also have witnesses who saw I was singled out multiple times. I suspect this was racially motivated discrimination." The 2 uniformed staff members exchanged glances, uncertain. Larrabee rubbed his temples. "Well, we take these allegations seriously. We also need to gather statements from the crew." Ebony gestured toward Hank and Dr. Monroe, both stepping forward. Hank showed his AeroWorld ID again, stating he had seen Ebony sober and respectful. "Doctor," Monroe presented her notes describing every instance of suspicious or biased treatment. The father from row 5 chimed in that he too felt unfairly targeted. In short, Ebony wasn't alone. Larrabee's face grew increasingly grave. He thanked them all for their input, promising a thorough investigation. Ebony doubted the sincerity of these promises, but at least she wasn't being detained or publicly shamed. She offered her contact information, then finally stepped away, eager to reclaim her freedom and start her long-awaited time in Paris. At first, Ebony tried to push the memory of the flight aside. She arrived at her quaint Airbnb in the Marais district, where the narrow streets and vibrant cafes breathed new life into her. Over the next few days, she explored Paris, marveling at the art in the Louvre, indulging in croissants at dawn, and taking in the magnificent view from atop the Eiffel Tower. For the most part, she tried to let the city's charm wash away the lingering bitterness of that flight, but the story refused to stay buried. Dr. Monroe, it turned out, was an avid social media user. She posted a detailed account of the incident on Twitter, tagging AeroWorld and a few journalists who specialized in consumer advocacy. Hank also filed an official report, citing a fellow crew member's unprofessional and discriminatory conduct. And Ebony herself, after reflecting for days, decided to share her ordeal on Instagram. She included photos of her seat, the mini champagne bottle with her name, and a heartfelt caption describing how she felt humiliated, threatened, and wronged. The post gained traction. Friends and followers reshared it, outraged by Ebony's story. Within a week, Ebony was fielding messages from local news outlets and bloggers who wanted interviews. She hesitated. Was she ready to relive the trauma publicly? Ultimately, Ebony decided her story might help bring about change. She consented to a few interviews, clarifying that she wasn't out for revenge. She simply wanted accountability and to highlight systemic issues. News of Ebony's ordeal snowballed. AeroWorld's public relations team scrambled, issuing a generic statement about valuing diversity and inclusion and promising a thorough internal investigation. However, the statement did little to quell the social media firestorm. People wanted a real resolution, not corporate platitudes. A high-profile journalist from a major newspaper picked up the story. Suddenly, Ebony's plight was no longer an isolated incident. Others came forward with their own accounts of discrimination on AeroWorld flights, some older, some more recent. #AeroWorld. While black became a trending topic for a weekend, in the midst of the uproar, Ebony tried to maintain her focus on her study abroad obligations, attending lectures on French literature by day and writing lengthy emails to journalists by night. Then an unexpected development occurred. The older black couple Ebony had seen in the lounge contacted her through social media. They had read about her story and recognized her. They recounted their own tensions with Irene at the lounge that day, offering to provide another statement if needed. It was a strange sort of validation. Ebony realized that while her experience was uniquely painful, it was not unique in the grand scheme of systemic bias. As Ebony's final week in Paris approached, AeroWorld's leadership could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. They issued a direct apology to Ebony via email, stating that appropriate disciplinary measures have been taken against the employee involved. While they didn't name Irene outright, Ebony knew who it referred to. The airline offered Ebony travel vouchers for future flights and an upgrade to first class for her return trip. They also donated a sum to a civil rights organization in Ebony's name, hoping for positive PR. But Ebony's story had transcended AeroWorld's internal attempts at damage control. The public demanded transparency. The airline faced cancellations and boycotts from outraged consumers. Activist groups threatened protests at major airports. Meanwhile, Ebony's social media following soared with thousands of people commending her for courage. She received messages from young girls who said her story inspired them to stand up for themselves. This Ebony realized was the silver lining. In a final blow, an internal memo leaked. It revealed that Irene had been flagged for multiple complaints, in the past complaints about her condescending attitude and alleged discriminatory remarks, all swept under the rug. The memo's release was the nail in the coffin. Aeroworld announced that Irene was no longer with the company. They also pledged to overhaul their diversity and inclusion training, not just as lip service, but under the watchful eyes of civil rights organizations. On Ebony's final night in Paris, the city glowed with its signature romance. Street lamps spilled golden light over cobblestone alleys, and the distant chime of a violin echoed through the Marais district. She sat alone on the wrought-iron balcony of a riverside cafe, her journal resting on the small table beside a nearly finished glass of champagne. Not Moët and Chandon this time, but a crisp local brut recommended by the smiling waiter who'd noticed the weariness behind her eyes and offered it on the house for a woman who looks like she's come a long way. Ebony gazed out over the Seine, watching the river reflect the shimmer of the Eiffel Tower in the distance. Every glint of light on the water reminded her how far she'd come, not just in miles, but in spirit. What was meant to be a dream trip had become a test of character, and somehow she'd passed. She lifted her glass, the cool rim pressing gently against her lower lip, and took a slow sip. The bubbles danced across her tongue, playful and sharp, just like her story. It tasted like survival, like reclamation, like justice served with a dash of sass. She smiled faintly, thinking back to that bottle with her name on it, a gift that had turned into a symbol of her self-worth and her refusal to be erased. All around her, Paris carried on. A couple embraced at the river's edge, a street performer juggled flaming torches under the gaze of clapping children, and the air smelled faintly of fresh bread and lilac perfume. For the first time in days, Ebony felt like she could breathe fully. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was a message from Dr. Monroe. CNN reached out. "They want to interview you. I told them you needed time. But the world is watching now. People care." Ebony replied with a heart emoji and tucked her phone away. She wasn't ready to make any big decisions tonight. Tonight wasn't about strategy. It was about reclaiming joy. She opened her journal and began to write not a complaint, not a report, not a timeline of events, just a letter to herself. Dear Ebony, you spoke up. You stayed calm. You were proud when others wanted you small. You turned humiliation into momentum. That flight didn't break you, it built you. Keep flying. Her fingers trembled as she signed the page not out of sadness, but because it felt like closing a chapter, literally and metaphorically. As the waiter returned to refill her glass, she raised it high, not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, for every girl who carried grace in the face of scorn, and for every underdog who turned turbulence into triumph. A small group at a neighboring table clinked glasses and toasted aloud in French à la victoire, to victory. Ebony whispered it back to herself, smiling. Tomorrow she would board her flight home, booked not through Aeroworld, but a rival airline that had offered her a free first-class ticket in solidarity. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd return to Atlanta not only with souvenirs and photos, but with a new sense of purpose. and while the city behind her twinkled like a crown of stars. Ebony closed her journal and let herself exhale for the first time in what felt like forever. She had arrived in Paris as a dreamer. She was leaving as a force. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional journey, where one young black woman faced blatant discrimination at 30,000 feet, but refused to let prejudice clip her wings. If you felt the rush of adrenaline when she pulled out that bottle with her own name on it, or if your heart pounded when karma finally caught up with those responsible, then don't let the story end here. Your voice matters, and sharing can spark real change. So please like this video, leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to my channel to stay connected. Together, we'll continue shining a light on stories of resilience, justice, and triumph. And never forget, you belong in every room you step into, every seat you've earned, and every dream you dare to dream. Let's keep rising, keep pushing, and keep the conversation going. Thank you, and see you next time.